It was supposed to be the kind of day that changes everything, a career-defining moment, the kind you rehearse in your head 100 times before it happens. I was sitting in my home office, surrounded by the hum of monitors and the faint smell of coffee gone cold, preparing to deliver the most important presentation of my life. The Zoom window was open, filled with the stoic faces of 12 government officials, including a high-ranking officer from Homeland Security, all waiting for me to unveil the final slide of my company's emergency communications deployment protocol. This wasn't just a pitch, it was the culmination of 6 months of sleepless nights, endless revisions, and a vision to revolutionize how mobile towers could be coordinated in disaster zones across the country. My heart was pounding, my palms were sweaty, but I was ready. Then, mid-sentence, as I clicked to reveal the slide that would seal the deal, the screen froze. The internet dropped. And just like that, my world went silent. I stared at the spinning buffer icon, that maddening little circle that seems to mock you when technology fails. It spun and spun, like it was laughing at me, while the faces of those officials, frozen in various stages of impatience, stared back from their little Zoom boxes. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint ping of my phone exploding with texts from my team. What happened? Are you back online? Did you lose the feed? I tried to refresh the connection, reboot the router, anything to claw my way back into that meeting, but nothing worked. The network was dead. My career, my company's 6-figure federal contract, and my reputation were all teetering on the edge of a digital cliff, and I had no idea why. I bolted out of my chair, my mind racing. This wasn't just a random outage. I'd checked the connection an hour before the meeting, and everything was rock solid. My setup wasn't some bargain bin router from Best Buy. I'm a network architect, for God's sake. I build signal infrastructures for field hospitals, disaster shelters, even military operations. My home office was wired with a fiber optic line, buried 6 feet underground, flagged and marked according to city code, and approved by every regulatory body that mattered. There was no way this was a coincidence. Something, or someone, had deliberately cut me off. I threw open the front door, still in my sweatpants and the button-up shirt I'd thrown on to look semi-professional on camera, and sprinted toward the utility trench at the edge of my property. That's when I saw her, Karen, the HOA president, standing there with her signature smirk, sipping an iced latte like she was auditioning for a Real Housewives episode. Next to her was a backhoe, its engine still rumbling, and one of her lackeys, a guy who looked like he'd never held a tool more complicated than a golf club, was rolling up my severed fiber optic cable like it was a garden hose. The cable, my lifeline to the world, was mangled, sliced clean through with surgical precision. I stood there, frozen, my brain struggling to process the audacity of it all. "Karen," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "what the hell is this?" She didn't even flinch. She just tilted her head, her sunglasses perched like a crown of judgment, and said, "We don't allow unapproved utility lines in this neighborhood. It's in the bylaws." Her tone was so casual, so smug, like she hadn't just torpedoed my career and ignited a war that would consume this quiet little suburb. I wanted to scream, to grab the latte out of her hand and throw it at the backhoe, but I knew that's what she wanted. Karen thrived on drama, on making people like me quiet, techie, not prone to public outbursts, feel small and powerless. "Let me get this straight," I said, stepping closer, my voice low but shaking with barely contained rage. "You cut my legally installed, city-approved fiber optic line because of some HOA rule? It's not just a rule," she snapped, waving a piece of paper in my face. "It's the amended bylaws. Underground lines disturb the harmony of our aesthetics. They're a safety concern." She said aesthetics like it was a sacred word, like my cable was some kind of blight on her perfectly manicured vision of suburban utopia. I stared at her, dumbfounded. My line wasn't visible. It was buried 6 feet underground, installed during the construction of my house, with every permit and inspection in place. This wasn't about aesthetics or safety. This was about power. Her power. I looked at the paper she was waving. It was a photocopy of some HOA document, probably drafted in one of her late-night board meetings where she and her two favorite cronies sipped wine and plotted ways to micromanage the neighborhood. The bylaws had been amended, she said, to require all utility installations to be community approved. No notice, no discussion, no vote. Just Karen and her clipboard, deciding what was allowed to exist in her little fiefdom. I glanced at the backhoe driver, who was now leaning against the machine, scrolling through his phone, completely uninterested in the chaos he'd helped unleash. The other guy, the one rolling up my cable, avoided my gaze, like he knew he was part of something shady, but didn't have the spine to back out. "Karen," I said, my voice steady now, "this is a private connection. It's not even visible to the neighborhood. It's for my work. You know, the work that keeps people safe during disasters? The work that was in the middle of a federal cybersecurity briefing when you decided to play cable guy." She shrugged, unbothered. "Doesn't matter. The HOA voted. It's a safety concern now." She emphasized voted like it was some democratic triumph, but I knew better. There was no vote. There was no community input. It was just Karen and her two lackeys sitting in her living room, rewriting the rules to suit her vendetta. I looked around, half expecting to see other neighbors watching, but the street was empty. That's how Karen operated behind closed doors, with no witnesses, no accountability. She treated my lifeline like it was just another weed to pull, another mailbox to repaint, another life to control. I knelt down next to the trench, staring at the severed cable. It wasn't just a piece of fiber optic. It was months of work, years of expertise, and a contract that could have changed the trajectory of my company. The meeting I'd been dropped from wasn't just a check-in. It was the final pitch to secure funding for a nationwide rollout of mobile towers designed to restore communications in disaster zones, hurricanes, earthquakes, wildfires. My team had spent half a year designing the architecture, testing redundancy protocols, and modeling signal coverage for worst-case scenarios. I'd personally overseen every detail, from the encryption standards to the failover mechanisms. That slide, the one I never got to present, was a map of how we'd bring connectivity back to entire regions when the grid went down. And now, because of Karen's petty power trip, it was all unraveling. I stood up, dusting the dirt off my knees, and faced her. "You have no idea what you've just done," I said, my voice cold. "This isn't just about my internet. You've screwed with a federal contract. You've screwed with national security." She rolled her eyes, actually rolled her eyes, like I was some kid whining about a broken toy. "Don't be so dramatic," she said. "It's just a cable. Get it approved next time." And with that, she turned on her heel, latte in hand, and strutted back toward her house, leaving me standing there with a trench full of ruined dreams and a backhoe driver who still wouldn't look me in the eye. I didn't go back inside right away. I stood there, staring at the trench, letting the weight of what had just happened sink in. This wasn't just a dropped call. This was a financial wrecking ball. My company was small, scrappy, built on the kind of hustle that only comes from believing in what you do. We weren't some faceless corporation with endless resources. We were a team of engineers and dreamers who'd bet everything on this contract. Losing it wouldn't just hurt me, it would hurt my employees, their families, and the communities we'd promised to serve. I thought about the texts still piling up on my phone, my team probably panicking, wondering how we'd explain this to the feds. I thought about the Homeland Security officer, probably scribbling notes about our unreliable infrastructure. And I thought about Karen, sitting in her McMansion, smugly checking another box on her HOA to-do list. But I didn't panic. I took a deep breath, pulled out my phone, and started snapping pictures of the trench, the cable, the backhoe, everything. I timestamped every photo, recorded a quick video of the scene, and sent it all to my lawyer with a single line: "We're going to war." Then I marched back to my office, plugged my laptop into my emergency mobile hotspot, and started digging. I pulled up the city permits for my cable installation, cross-referenced them with the HOA's bylaws, and found exactly what I expected: Karen's amended rules were a sham. The HOA had no authority to touch my line. It was installed under municipal oversight, with every box checked and every fee paid. She'd overstepped, big time, and I was going to make sure she paid for it. As I worked, my mind kept circling back to Karen. This wasn't just about a cable. It was personal. I'd lived in this neighborhood for 3 years, kept my head down, paid my dues, and never once crossed her. But Karen didn't need a reason to target someone. She was on a rampage, had been for weeks. I'd heard the stories: neighbors fined for unsanctioned solar panels, cited for porch lights that weren't the right shade of HO warm white, harassed for planting flowers that didn't match the community palette. She wasn't just enforcing rules, she was enforcing fear. And I, the quiet guy who worked from home and didn't show up to her potlucks, had somehow landed in her crosshairs. I thought about the other neighbors, the ones who'd been too scared to push back. There was Sarah, a single mom who'd been fined for letting her grass grow half an inch too long during a week when her kid was in the hospital. There was Mr. Thompson, a retiree who'd been forced to remove his bird feeder because it attracted pests. And there was the young couple down the street, who'd moved in full of excitement only to be crushed by Karen's endless inspections and passive-aggressive notes. This wasn't just my fight. It was everyone's. Karen had turned this neighborhood into her personal kingdom, and she'd just made the mistake of declaring war on someone who knew how to fight back. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the outage report on my screen. The damage was done, but the game was far from over. Karen thought she'd won by cutting my cable, thought she'd humiliated me in front of the feds and put me in my place. But she didn't know who she was dealing with. I wasn't just some guy who liked tech. I was a network architect who'd built signal towers in hurricane zones, restored communications in war-torn regions, and wired entire cities when the grid was nothing but ash. Karen hadn't just messed with my internet. She'd messed with someone who built the internet. And I was going to make sure she regretted it. I closed my laptop, grabbed a notepad, and started sketching. Not a plan for revenge, not yet, but a plan to rebuild. To bypass her. To outsmart her. I knew I couldn't fix the cable overnight, but I could do something better. I could build a system she couldn't touch, a network that would light up this neighborhood and leave her in the dark. I thought about the hilltop just outside HOA jurisdiction, a sliver of land owned by a friend who owed me a favor. I thought about the 35-foot masts I could erect, the mesh repeaters I could deploy, the directional antennas I could calibrate to blanket the area with signal. And I thought about Karen, standing there with her latte, thinking she'd won. She had no idea what was coming. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across my office, I felt a strange calm settle over me. This wasn't just about a contract anymore. It wasn't just about my career or my company. It was about power, real power, the kind that comes from giving people something they need and taking it away from those who think they can control it. Karen had snipped my cable, thinking she could sever my connection to the world. But what she'd really done was give me a reason to build something bigger, something that would change this neighborhood forever. I wasn't going to let her win. Not today, not ever. And as I started drafting the specs for my new network, one thought kept looping in my mind. This is how revolutions start. One cut at a time. The sun was barely up, casting a pale orange glow over the neighborhood, but I was already wide awake, fueled by a mix of rage and determination. Karen's smug face from the day before was burned into my brain, her sipping that iced latte, waving her fake bylaws like a dictator's decree, and dismissing the wreckage she'd caused as if it were nothing. She thought she'd won, thought she'd clipped my wings and left me scrambling. But she didn't know me. She didn't know what I was capable of. I wasn't just some guy who'd sulk and move on. I was a network architect, a builder of systems that brought light to the darkest corners of disaster zones. And if Karen wanted a war, I was going to give her one she'd never forget. By the time I was done, she'd be begging for a signal while the rest of the neighborhood thrived. This was my counterstrike, and it started now. I sat at my desk, my laptop tethered to a mobile hotspot, my emergency backup, because of course I had one. Karen might have cut my fiber optic line, but she hadn't cut my ability to think, to plan, to build. The first thing I did was pull up the specs for my home network, confirming what I already knew. The cable she destroyed was legally installed, fully permitted and untouchable by her HOA nonsense. I saved screenshots of the permits, the city approvals, the utility maps, every piece of evidence that proved she'd overstepped. This wasn't just about fixing my internet. It was about building a case, a fortress of proof that would make her regret ever picking up that backhoe's phone number. But legal battles were slow, and I wasn't in the mood to wait. I needed something faster, something that would hit her where it hurt, her control. That's when the idea hit me. A network. Not just a replacement for my severed cable, but something bigger, something unstoppable. A Wi-Fi system that would blanket the entire area, free for everyone except Karen and her HOA cronies. I'd turn her little kingdom into a digital dead zone while the rest of the world streamed on without her. The thought made me smile for the first time since the Zoom call crashed. I grabbed a legal pad and started sketching. Masts, repeaters, antennas, power sources. I wasn't just going to restore my connection. I was going to build a monument to her failure, a beacon of freedom that would shine so bright she'd choke on her own pettiness. The first step was finding the right location. Karen's HOA had jurisdiction over the neighborhood, but their reach didn't extend beyond the property lines. I knew a guy, Tom, who owned a small plot of land on a hilltop just outside the HOA's boundaries. Tom was an old friend from my disaster relief days, a grizzled contractor who'd helped me set up mobile towers in hurricane-ravaged towns. He owed me a favor after I'd bailed him out of a permitting mess a few years back, and when I called him that morning, he didn't hesitate. "You want to stick it to an HOA?" he said, chuckling. "I'm in. What do you need?" I told him I needed a lease for a sliver of his land, just enough for a couple of 35-foot masts and a mobile base station. He didn't even ask for details, just sent me the paperwork and said, "Go make M cry." With the land secured, I got to work on the technical side. This wasn't going to be some off-the-shelf Wi-Fi router slapped on a pole. I was building a hyperlocal mesh network, the kind I deployed in war zones and disaster shelters. It would use directional antennas to maximize coverage, mesh repeaters to ensure redundancy, and a smart access filter to control who could connect. The filter was the key. I'd program it to blacklist every address in the HOA's directory, ensuring that Karen and her minions were locked out while everyone else, every neighbor, every school, every park, got fast, reliable, free internet. It was petty, sure, but it was also poetic. She'd cut my line to flex her power. I'd build a network to take it away. I spent the next few hours pulling up equipment specs, cross-referencing power requirements, and calculating signal propagation. The hilltop was perfect, high enough to avoid obstructions, close enough to cover the neighborhood and beyond. I'd need 2 masts, each with a high-gain antenna, plus a solar array for power redundancy. The base station would run on a custom Linux setup with a firewall I'd code myself to handle the blacklisting. I'd also need a concrete foundation for stability, a chain-link fence for security, and a few infrared cameras to catch any of Karen's goons if they came sniffing around. The total cost was steep, about $15,000 out of my own pocket, but it was worth it. This wasn't just about Wi-Fi. It was about principle. About showing Karen that her little clipboard empire was no match for someone who knew how to build. By noon, I'd placed orders for the equipment, antennas from a supplier in Texas, solar panels from a company in California, and a custom-built base station from a tech co-op I'd worked with in the past. I also reached out to a local contractor, a guy named Mike who'd helped me install temporary towers during a wildfire response. Mike was a no-nonsense type, the kind of guy who'd show up with a truck full of tools and get the job done before Karen could even file a complaint. I sent him the site plans and told him we needed to move fast. "You're really doing this, huh?" he said, his voice tinged with amusement. "HOA's gonna lose their minds." I laughed. That's the plan. While the equipment was being shipped, I turned my attention to the legal side. Karen might have thought she could hide behind her bylaws, but I wasn't playing her game. I filed a notice of wireless facility activation with the FCC, flagged the project as an emergency communications operation, and submitted paperwork to the city under infrastructure enhancement protocols. These weren't just bureaucratic hoops, they were shields. By classifying the project as critical infrastructure, I was putting it under federal protection, making it untouchable by Karen's HOA or any of her small-town allies. I also sent a courtesy copy to the county planning office, just to cover my bases. If Karen tried to interfere, she'd be stepping into a legal minefield, and I'd be ready with every permit, every regulation, every precedent in my corner. The next day, Mike and his crew showed up at the hilltop to pour the concrete foundation. It was a small operation, just a mixer truck, a few guys with shovels, and a lot of sweat, but it felt like the start of something monumental. I stood there, watching the cement harden, imagining the mast that would soon rise like a middle finger to Karen's reign. That's when she showed up, of course. I'd been expecting her. She wasn't the type to let a construction project go unnoticed. She pulled up in her beige SUV, parked way too close to the work zone, and stormed over with her clipboard and a look that could curdle milk. Her sunglasses were pushed up on her head, her latte was predictably in hand, and her voice was already at full volume before she even reached me. "What is this?" she demanded, gesturing at the half-poured foundation like it was a personal insult. "You can't just build whatever you want out here. This is a residential area." I stayed calm, leaning against a stack of rebar, and handed her a folder, 3 inches thick, stuffed with every permit, approval, and compliance report I'd compiled. "Take a look," I said, my voice steady but laced with just enough edge to let her know I wasn't intimidated. "City permit, FCC filing, FAA clearance for the tower height, RF safety inspection. It's all there." She snatched the folder, flipped through the first page, and her face turned a shade of red that matched her manicured nails. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "Satellite dishes now? This isn't a war zone." "Not yet," I said, meeting her glare. "But you're working on it." She tossed the folder back at me, the papers fluttering to the ground, and I could see the gears turning in her head. She wasn't used to being outmaneuvered, especially not by someone like me, someone she'd written off as a quiet nerd who'd roll over at the first sign of trouble. But I wasn't rolling over. I was building. And what I was building wasn't just a tower, it was a system. A network that would rewrite the rules of her little world. Over the next few days, the hilltop transformed. The masts went up, sleek and silver, catching the sunlight like beacons. The solar array was mounted, its panels angled to soak up every ray. The base station hummed to life, its LEDs blinking in a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. I spent hours calibrating the antennas, tweaking the mesh repeaters, and coding the access filter. The filter was my masterpiece, a custom script that cross-referenced every HOA address against a database I'd pulled from public records. If your house was in Karen's domain, you were blacklisted. No signal, no access, no mercy. I even added a layer of VPN detection to block any attempts to mask IP addresses. If Karen thought she could outsmart me with a $10 app from the App Store, she was in for a rude awakening. By the end of the week, the network was live. I named it Free to All Except Karen, a tongue-in-cheek jab that I knew would spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. I stood on the hilltop, my laptop open, watching the first devices connect. Green dots lit up my coverage map, neighbors' phones, tablets, laptops, all pinging back with solid bandwidth. The signal stretched for miles, covering every street, every park, every school. Kids streamed videos with no lag. Parents uploaded work files in seconds. The local fire station, which I'd quietly granted access to, sent me a thank you email for giving them a backup signal. It was working. It was perfect. And in the middle of my map, like a black hole, sat the HOA neighborhood. Silent, disconnected, Dark. I didn't stop there. I added a public landing page for the network, a simple site with a message, "Welcome to Freedom Net." Fast, free, and open to everyone except those who think they can control it. I included a FAQ explaining how to connect, how to troubleshoot, and why certain addresses might be experiencing technical difficulties. It was petty, sure, but it was also strategic. I wanted Karen to know this wasn't an accident. I wanted her to feel the walls closing in. The neighbors outside the HOA started noticing the signal almost immediately. I'd configured the network to auto-connect for non-HOA addresses, no password required. People walked their dogs, phones in hand, grinning as they discovered a Wi-Fi signal that didn't drop, didn't throttle, and didn't cost a dime. Word spread fast. By day 2, I was getting texts from people I barely knew, neighbors I'd only waved to in passing, thanking me for the mystery Wi-Fi. One guy, a dad from down the street, sent me a picture of his kid streaming a cartoon on a tablet with the caption, "You're a hero, man." It hit me harder than I expected. This wasn't just about sticking it to Karen anymore. It was about giving people something real, something that made their lives better. Karen, predictably, didn't take it lying down. She showed up at the hilltop again, this time with one of her bored lackeys in tow, a guy named Gary who always looked like he was one bad decision away from a midlife crisis. She demanded to see new permits, claiming the tower was a visual nuisance and a potential hazard. I handed her another binder, this one even thicker than the last, with updated FCC compliance reports and a letter from the local fire chief endorsing the project as a public safety asset. She flipped through it, her jaw tightening with every page, and I could see the realization dawning. She was out of her depth. She wasn't dealing with a random homeowner. She was dealing with someone who'd written the playbook for this kind of fight. "This isn't over," she hissed, shoving the binder back at me. "I'm consulting a legal advisor." "Good luck with that," I said, smiling for the first time in days. "You might want to brush up on the Telecommunications Act while you're at it." She stormed off, Gary trailing behind her like a scolded puppy, and I knew she'd be back. People like Karen don't give up, they double down. But I was ready. I'd built this network to be bulletproof, legally and technically. The permits were ironclad, the equipment was top tier, and the signal was unstoppable. I'd even installed a backup generator, just in case she got any ideas about cutting power lines next. Every angle was covered, every weakness accounted for. This wasn't just a project, it was a fortress. As the days went on, the network grew stronger. I tweaked the signal strength, optimized the routing algorithms, and added more repeaters to extend the range. The coverage map on my laptop was a thing of beauty, green dots spreading like wildfire, connecting homes, businesses, even a small library a mile away. I started getting emails from people I didn't know, thanking me for the signal, asking if I could help them set up their own networks. It was humbling, but it also lit a fire under me. This wasn't just about my neighborhood anymore. It was about showing people what was possible when you stopped letting petty tyrants like Karen run the show. One night, I sat on the hilltop, watching the sunset paint the masts gold. The hum of the base station was steady, comforting, like the pulse of something alive. I opened my laptop and checked the logs, hundreds of devices connected, thousands of gigabytes transferred, 0 outages. It was working better than I'd ever imagined. And somewhere down there, in her perfectly manicured McMansion, Karen was sitting in the dark, her internet probably crawling along on some overpriced ISP plan, wondering how it all went wrong. I didn't feel sorry for her. Not even a little. She'd started this war, and I was just getting started. I closed my laptop and looked out over the neighborhood. The lights were coming on, one by one, in houses that were now connected in a way they'd never been before. Kids were probably watching YouTube, parents were probably paying bills, and someone was probably FaceTiming their grandma, all because of a signal Karen couldn't touch. This wasn't just about Wi-Fi. It was about freedom. And I was going to make sure it spread, one signal bar at a time, until Karen's little empire was nothing but a footnote in the story of what came next. The hilltop glowed under the morning sun, the masts standing tall like sentinels, their antennas humming with a signal that had already changed the game. Freedom Net was live, blanketing the neighborhood with fast, free Wi-Fi, a digital middle finger to Karen and her HOA tyranny. Every green on my coverage map was a victory: neighbors streaming movies, kids doing homework, small businesses uploading orders, all connected by a network Karen couldn't touch. And in the heart of my map, like a stain, sat the HOA's dead zone, blacklisted by my custom filter, a deliberate blackout that left Karen and her cronies surfing the digital dark ages. I'd built the system to hit her where it hurt, to strip away her control and give it back to the people. But this wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about something bigger, about a community waking up, shaking off years of fear and taking back what was theirs. Karen had started this war, but I was about to finish it. The first signs of the shift came fast. Neighbors outside the HOA's grip were buzzing about the mystery Wi-Fi that never dropped. I'd named the network Free to All Except Karen as a jab, but it was catching on like wildfire. People were posting about it on Nextdoor, sharing memes of buffering icons with Karen's face photoshopped onto them. One guy, a barista at the local coffee shop, sent me a screenshot of his phone connected to Freedom Net with a caption, "Whoever did this, I owe you a latte." It wasn't just about the signal, it was about what it represented. For years, Karen had ruled this neighborhood with her clipboard and her fines, making people feel small, powerless, afraid to step out of line. Now, with every device that connected to my network, that fear was crumbling. People were talking again, not just online, but in person, on sidewalks, at mailboxes, in driveways. The signal wasn't just Wi-Fi, it was a spark. Inside the HOA, though, things were getting ugly. Karen knew she was losing ground, and she wasn't going down quietly. She sent out a mass email to the neighborhood, a desperate attempt to spin the narrative. The subject line read, "Unauthorized signal threatens community safety," and the body was a masterclass in fear-mongering. She claimed an unnamed resident, guess who, was operating a rogue tower that could interfere with official HOA-endorsed internet providers. She warned of potential health risks from unregulated radiation and even threw in a line about how the signal might disrupt emergency services. It was laughable, but it was also dangerous. Karen was trying to rally her loyalists, to paint me as some tech villain destabilizing her perfect little world. The irony was thicker than her latte foam. She'd cut my legally installed cable, declared war on my bandwidth, and now she was crying foul because I'd outplayed her. I didn't respond to the email. I didn't need to. The neighbors were already doing it for me. Comments flooded the Nextdoor thread, calling her out. One woman, a nurse who'd been fined for parking her car incorrectly during a 12-hour shift, wrote, "Maybe if the HOA spent less time cutting cables and more time fixing potholes, we wouldn't need a rogue signal." Another guy, a retiree who'd been cited for his unapproved mailbox color, posted a meme of a skeleton waiting for Karen's approved internet to load. The tide was turning and Karen could feel it. Her grip was slipping, and for the first time, she wasn't the one controlling the narrative. But Karen wasn't done. She was too stubborn, too obsessed with her own power to back down. A few days after the email, I caught wind of her next move. Two guys, claiming to be utility inspectors, were spotted wandering near the base of my tower. They were dressed in cheap vests that looked like they'd been ordered off Amazon, carrying clipboards and a flashlight that one of them kept fumbling. I approached them casually, hands in my pockets, and asked who sent them. They mumbled something about a noise complaint and flashed a laminated ID that looked like it was made in Microsoft Word. I pressed them, asked if they were with the city, the county, or some federal agency. They exchanged nervous glances and bolted without answering. Later that night, my security cameras caught the real culprit, Karen, skulking around the tower in her beige trench coat, snapping photos of the solar array and muttering to herself. She wasn't even trying to hide anymore. She was fishing for anything: a loose wire, a missing permit, a blade of grass out of place, that she could use to shut me down. I doubled down. I filed additional paperwork to designate the tower as a registered auxiliary emergency node, partnering with a volunteer disaster response group I'd worked with in the past. I sent copies of the declaration to the city, the county, and, for good measure, my congressional representative. This wasn't just about protecting the tower. It was about locking Karen out of any legal loophole she might try to exploit. The tower was now officially part of a federally recognized emergency communications network, meaning any attempt to tamper with it would be a criminal act, not just an HOA violation. I also upgraded the security: more cameras, motion sensors, and a reinforced lock on the gate. If Karen wanted to play dirty, I was ready to bury her in consequences. Meanwhile, FreedomNet was doing more than just providing Wi-Fi. It was changing lives. A single mom down the street used the signal to apply for a remote job, landing an interview that same week. A high school kid started streaming his gaming sessions, building a small following that gave him confidence he'd never had before. The local library, which had been struggling with spotty internet, hooked into the network and started offering free online tutoring for kids. Even the fire station, which I'd granted access to, sent me a letter thanking me for giving them a reliable backup signal during a recent power outage. Every connection was a reminder of why I was doing this, not just to screw over Karen, but to give people something she'd never understand: freedom. The community was waking up, and it wasn't just about the Wi-Fi anymore. Karen's reign had always depended on silence, on neighbors too scared or too busy to challenge her. But now, with the signal connecting people, they were talking, organizing, pushing back. I started hearing whispers of a petition to remove her from the HOA board. At first, it was just a few neighbors venting over coffee, but it grew fast. A retired teacher named Linda, who'd been fined for her unapproved garden, started passing around a sign-up sheet. A Gulf War veteran named Carl, who'd been hassled for flying a flag that wasn't HOA compliant, offered to knock on doors. Even the young couple down the street, who'd been too intimidated to speak up before, started handing out flyers. The petition wasn't just about Karen, it was about every fine, every threat, every moment she'd made someone feel like they didn't belong in their own home. I stayed out of the petition drive, not because I didn't care, but because I didn't want it to look like my personal vendetta. This wasn't about me, it was about the community taking back its voice. But I did quietly support it. I printed flyers at my house, using the same laser printer I'd used to churn out permit applications. I let Linda use my network to email the petition to every non-HOA resident, spreading the word faster than Karen's golf cart patrols could keep up. And I kept the signal strong, making sure every device in the neighborhood stayed connected, every voice stayed heard. Karen, of course, wasn't going to let this slide. She called an emergency HOA board meeting, pushing a vote to file a cease and desist order against my tower. She claimed it was a community safety concern, trotting out the same tired lies about radiation and interference. I showed up to the meeting, not as a petitioner, but as a resident with a point to make. I brought 2 laptops, one showing the tower's legal status, with every permit and FCC regulation highlighted, and the other displaying real-time speed tests from nearby neighborhoods. I walked the room through the paperwork, calm but unrelenting, explaining how the tower was not only legal but a public good, endorsed by the fire chief and used by local schools. Then I dropped the bomb. Security footage of Karen, caught red-handed trying to dismantle my repeater node with a wrench under cover of night. The room gasped. One woman, a quiet retiree who'd never spoken at a meeting before, muttered, "She's lost it." Karen's face turned beet red, and she tried to spin it, claiming she thought the equipment was abandoned. But I was ready for that. I played a second clip, her voice clear as day. "Let's rip this junk out before he gets more attention." The lie fell apart, and so did her credibility. The board didn't vote on the cease and desist. Instead, they voted to hold a recall election, the first step to ousting Karen and her loyalists. Her mask cracked as she realized the very rules she'd weaponized for years could now be turned against her. The petition gained momentum overnight. It wasn't just whispers anymore, it was a movement. Neighbors who'd never cared about HOA politics were suddenly knocking on doors, wearing buttons that read "Uncare in our community." By the end of the week, over 70% of the residents had signed, a landslide that left no doubt about where the neighborhood stood. They were done with the fines, the fear, the surveillance-style patrols. My tower had been the spark, but the fire was theirs. They were ready to burn Karen's empire to the ground. The night of the recall vote was electric. The community center was packed, standing room only, with people who hadn't attended an HOA meeting in years now shoulder to shoulder, their faces a mix of determination and hope. Karen walked in, flanked by her two remaining board allies, dressed like she was hosting a charity gala, but her eyes betrayed her arrogance mixed with panic, the look of someone who knows the odds are stacked against them. The vote was by secret ballot, no speeches, no drama, just quiet resolve. Residents filed in, marked their boxes, and dropped their votes into a locked box guarded by a third-party moderator to prevent any claims of bias. I stood in the back, arms folded, watching it unfold. The air was thick with anticipation, but there was no chaos, no shouting matches. Just a community doing what it should have done years ago. When the ballots were counted, the moderator read the results. Karen was recalled with 78% in favor. Her two loyalists were voted out with similar margins. A cheer erupted, not wild or vengeful, but cathartic, like a collective exhale after years of holding their breath. Karen stood frozen, her face a mask of disbelief, as if she couldn't fathom how her little kingdom had crumbled in 10 minutes of counting. What happened next was pure poetry. The new board, a retired teacher, a veteran, and a software engineer, didn't waste a second. Their first vote was to lift the digital blackout Karen had enforced. They reached out to me, asking for full access to FreedomNet, and even proposed a resident-run tech advisory committee to ensure the network served everyone. I nodded, handed over the access codes, and within seconds, the signal lit up the HOA neighborhood like a fireworks show. Phones buzzed, tablets pinged, and someone shouted, "We're online." The room burst into laughter and applause. It wasn't just internet, it was a symbol. The blackout was over and the community had taken control. The next day, I walked through the neighborhood, watching people reconnect. Kids were streaming cartoons, parents were checking emails, and one old guy was FaceTiming his grandkids, grinning like he'd just won the lottery. The signal was strong, seamless, a reminder of what happens when you give people a reason to fight. Karen's house, though, stayed quiet. I didn't know if she was even home, but I didn't care. Her time was up, and the neighborhood was moving on without her. The signal had spread, the community had spoken, and Karen's reign was nothing but a bad memory, fading faster than a dropped call. The dust had settled, but the signal was stronger than ever. FreedomNet pulsed through the neighborhood, its green dots lighting up my coverage map like a constellation of defiance. Karen's empire had crumbled, her recall a unanimous rejection of her petty tyranny, and the community was alive in a way it hadn't been in years. Neighbors waved to each other on sidewalks, laughed in driveways, and gathered at mailboxes without the shadow of her clipboard looming over them. The tower on the hilltop stood tall, a steel monument to what happens when you push back against control, and I stood at its base, hammering a small wooden sign into the ground. Strong signal, stronger people. It wasn't just a slogan, it was a promise, a reminder that this victory wasn't mine alone. It belonged to every neighbor who'd signed the petition, every voice that had dared to speak, every person who'd felt the weight of Karen's reign and refused to bow. But the story wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Karen's defeat was just the beginning, and what came next would echo far beyond our little suburb, a signal that couldn't be silenced. The morning after the recall, I woke to an anonymous envelope on my doorstep. Inside was a hand-drawn card, crayon-colored bars rising in a curve, a smiley face, and the words, "Thank you for the Wi-Fi. My dad got a new job because of you." It was signed by Mia, a kid who lived 2 streets over. I stood there, staring at the card, the weight of it hitting me harder than any contract or federal briefing ever could. This wasn't just about beating Karen or restoring my connection. It was about people like Mia's dad, who'd used Freedom Net to apply for a job that changed his family's future. It was about the single mom who'd landed a remote gig, the high schooler streaming his first gaming channel, the library offering free tutoring to kids who'd been left behind. Every connection was a life touched, a door opened, a chance reclaimed. I tucked the card into my desk drawer, a quiet reminder of why I'd fought so hard, and got back to work. Karen, meanwhile, had gone silent. Her beige SUV hadn't been seen in days, her house dark behind its perfectly trimmed hedges. Rumors swirled. Some said she was trying to sell. Others claimed she was drafting a public apology no one wanted to hear. Most people didn't care. The neighborhood had moved on, its focus shifting from her downfall to what came next. The new HOA board, a retired teacher, a Gulf War veteran, and a software engineer, wasted no time. They launched a community portal on Freedom Net, a digital hub that went beyond Wi-Fi. Parents could access school forms and tutoring resources. Seniors could schedule rides to doctor's appointments. Teenagers found local internships, and the fire department linked in for emergency weather alerts. The portal wasn't just a tool, it was a lifeline, a way to knit the community together in ways Karen's fines and patrols never could. I threw myself into the portal's development, coding late into the night, adding features that turned it into more than a website. It became a platform for connection, a place where neighbors could share job leads, organize block parties, or post alerts about lost pets. I set up a tech help section where teens volunteered to teach seniors how to navigate their tablets, bridging gaps that had nothing to do with Wi-Fi. The portal was free, open source, and Karen-proof, built to withstand any attempt to control it. I even named the firewall protocol Karen Lockout, a nod to the blacklist that still hummed in the network's core, a reminder of what happens when power is abused. It wasn't spite, it was strategy, a safeguard against the next would-be tyrant who thought they could rule with a clipboard. The tower's impact rippled outward. Local businesses, a cafe, a bookstore, a food pantry, asked to link into the mesh, and I gave them temporary access codes. The cafe started streaming live music nights, drawing crowds that hadn't come in years. The bookstore hosted virtual author talks, its sales spiking as readers from neighboring towns tuned in. The food pantry used the signal to coordinate deliveries, ensuring no family went hungry during a recent storm. Freedom Net wasn't just Wi-Fi anymore. It was infrastructure, a backbone for a community that had rediscovered its strength. And every time I checked the logs, hundreds of devices, thousands of gigabytes, 0 outages, I felt a quiet pride. This was what Karen had tried to destroy, and it was thriving in spite of her. Then came the unexpected. A journalist from a national tech magazine reached out, wanting to write about grassroots internet solutions and how communities could break free from overpriced ISPs and HOAs like Karen's. I hesitated at first. I didn't want the spotlight, but I agreed to meet. We sat on the hilltop, the tower looming behind us, and I walked her through the system. The masts, the repeaters, the solar array, the custom filter that kept Karen's block in the dark. I told her how it started, not as some grand plan to save the world, but as a response to one woman's petty sabotage. The article ran a week later, titled, "How One Man Beat an HOA and Gave a Neighborhood the Internet It Deserved." It went viral, shared across social media, picked up by tech blogs and local news. My inbox flooded with messages from strangers, people in Ohio, Texas, California, asking how to build their own towers, how to fight their own Karens. I couldn't answer them all, But I started posting tutorials, open source guides, and templates, planting seeds for a movement I hadn't planned to start. The attention didn't stop there. A streaming platform reached out, pitching a docuseries about the real-life David versus Goliath of my fight with Karen. I pushed back, insisting the focus be on the community, not just me. They agreed, and soon cameras were rolling in my backyard, where I'd once dug cable trenches in frustration. They interviewed Mia, who shyly showed her crayon card on camera. They talked to the fire chief, who credited FreedomNet with saving lives during a recent blackout. They filmed the teacher who'd used the portal to host virtual classes, and the veteran who'd rallied neighbors for the recall. The story didn't need embellishment. It was raw, real, and powerful. The final episode aired with a neighborhood cookout on the hill, burgers grilling, music playing, and a projector screen streaming the event live via FreedomNet. A drone captured the crowd, panning out to show the tower standing tall, a beacon of resilience against the sunset. Karen made one last appearance that night. She showed up alone. No clipboard, no entourage, just her and her tiny Pomeranian, lingering at the edge of the gathering. Her hoodie was pulled low, her sunglasses on despite the dusk, as if she could hide from the world she'd lost. I caught her eye across the crowd, but she didn't approach. She just stood there, staring up at the tower, then turned and walked away. For the first time, I saw no scowl, no defiance, just exhaustion, the look of someone who'd finally realized the game was over. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't need to. Her silence was louder than any victory lap. The weeks that followed were a blur of progress. The community portal grew, adding a job board that helped a dozen residents find work. A local podcast, Signal Strength, launched, featuring stories of neighbors who'd overcome Karen's reign, veterans, teachers, even the kid who'd turned his lemonade stand into an online candy shop using tutorials from the network. The HOA board meetings became what they should have been: boring, practical, focused on potholes and playgrounds instead of fines and fear. The neighborhood felt different, lighter, like a place where people could breathe again. Then came the memes. The security footage of Karen swinging a wrench at my repeater had leaked, hitting 1 million views on a subreddit called Karen versus the Signal. Her face, frozen in mid-swing, became a punchline. Buffering Karen, they called her the patron saint of tech tantrums. She tried to fight back, going on a local radio show to claim I'd brainwashed the neighborhood with my psychological warfare tower. The host laughed, asking if she thought the internet was a government plot. Her pause, "I'm not saying that, but I'm not saying it," was the final nail in her credibility's coffin. The world moved on, and Karen faded into irrelevance, a cautionary tale of what happens when you underestimate a community's resolve. The tower's legacy grew beyond our borders. My tutorials inspired a handful of communities to build their own networks, from a rural town in Oregon to a suburb in Georgia. I consulted with them remotely, sharing code and strategies, watching their own freedom nets come online. The docuseries won an award, and I was invited to speak at a tech conference, where I told the crowd that the real heroes weren't the coders or the engineers, but the neighbors who'd signed the petition, who'd stood up when it mattered. Back home, someone added a plaque to my sign at the tower's base, formerly known as Dead Zone. I laughed when I saw it, the kind of quiet humor that had been missing for too long. One evening, I walked up the hill just before sunset, the sky burning gold behind the tower's silhouette. The hum of the routers was steady, the wind rustling through the trees, and somewhere below, kids were laughing, parents were streaming movies, and someone was probably FaceTiming their grandma. I thought about Mia's card, about the fire chief's letter, about the neighbors who'd found their voices. This wasn't just a network, it was a revolution, built not with weapons or war, but with signal bars and solidarity. Karen had tried to sever our connection, thinking she could keep us small, silent, afraid. But she'd forgotten one truth: a strong signal doesn't just connect devices, it connects people. And when people connect, when they stand together, no tyrant, no clipboard, No petty rule can hold them back. The tower stood as a lighthouse, its signal stretching far beyond the hill, carrying a message to anyone who'd listen. Freedom isn't given, it's built, one bar at a time. Karen was gone, her power reduced to a fading meme, but the signal remained, unbreakable, unstoppable, a testament to what happens when you dare to fight for what's right. And as the stars began to flicker above, I knew this was only the beginning. The signal would spread, the story would grow, and somewhere, someone else would pick up the tools to build their own tower, their own freedom. Because once you give people a taste of connection, real, raw, unshackled connection, they'll never go back to buffering. Never.